Hi students, this is Dr. Sands and I'm doing something a little bit different than I usually do for my videos for our class. I normally just talk to you and do a regular video, but today I'm going to do a screencast because I want to talk about commas. And commas are a lot of times perceived as tricky and mysterious and very difficult to learn. But they're actually not. It's just that most of us have never had anyone set us down and say, these are the exact rules and this is what they mean. So what I'm doing is I'm using the Online Writing Lab, or the OWL, from Excelsior College, because it's a beautiful OWL and it's a resource that I share a lot with you. And I'm going to use their comma rules to summarize and then just kind of add a few of my notes as I go through. So we're going to go through these comma rules, and then I'm going to talk to you about how you can best use these comma rules to help you improve and not have commas marked so much in your papers. I want to start by just saying that I do understand about commas feeling tricky. When I was probably in junior high, I had a teacher tell me to put a comma where you put a breath, or where you feel like you should take a breath. And I've had students say that they learned that as well. And I would say that's probably some of the worst advice that you could give someone. And I always say this, what if you had a stopped up nose and you're like taking a breath every a few words? Like, this is not a good plan. There are some rules, they're not that difficult. And the ones that are more difficult, we'll talk about those, about how you don't have to know them quite as much as you need to know some of the others. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the key comma rules according to academic guidelines, and I should add this before we dig in. These are the comma rules for academic writing. As we have talked about, everything is rhetorical in writing, and not every situation is going to be the same. So if you are writing for a newspaper or for a blog, you might not use these academic rules for punctuation. I had a very wise linguistic professor friend say that in terms of grammar and punctuation, you want to think of it as like the clothes you wear. It should always be appropriate to the situation. So the comma rules that I'm giving you today are the comma rules for an academic writing situation. With that said, I will tell you that professionally and in some of the other work that I have done outside of academia, I generally stick to the academic comma rules, and it has never caused me any problems. In fact, it has served me well. I probably, because I had a good training in academia, know more about commas than most people, and my job here is to help you know more about commas than most people. So I'll quit rambling and dig in. So let's start with rule number one. And this is the rule that you should use a comma with a coordinating conjunction when you are joining two independent clauses, or what we would call like a complete thought or sentence. Now, in order to remember this rule, you kind of just have to memorize the coordinating conjunctions. Then there are only 7 of them: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so, sometimes called the fanboys. So you have to remember those. If you are using these words to join two complete thoughts, then you need a comma before one of those words. Here's the example. I am preparing for a zombie invasion, and I am building a strong zombie fort around my home. So here I have one complete thought. Here I have a second complete thought. Subject verb, subject verb. I know I have 2 complete sentences. I must have the comma with the and in that sentence. Now, don't get excited and think, oh, every time I have one of those fanboys, I need a comma, because that's not the case. Let's say you are not joining 2 independent clauses, and here I'm just listing 2 things as a part of my predicate in the sentence. So I am preparing for a zombie invasion and am building a strong zombie fort around my home. Because I took away the subject, I no longer have 2 independent clauses, and all I need is the and. So that's rule number 1. Rule number 2 is the comma in a series rule. Now, this is the rule that is kind of on its way out outside of academia. And this is the rule that says when you list three or more items that you use commas to separate them. One that is changing is the comma before the and in the list. So here I ate popcorn, peanuts, and chocolate. In academic writing, we still use that comma for the most part. You may have heard it called the Oxford comma. With that said, one thing to be aware of is that if you are using APA style, it actually still requires that comma. So if you have a professor who's like, I don't want you to use the Oxford comma, if you're using APA, you might at least raise that question. One of the things we say is that if you run into a professor who doesn't want you to use that comma, just make sure you don't and be consistent, because that last comma is kind of on its way out. But if you're writing in academic writing, especially if you're using APA format, you're going to need that comma before the and in the series. Now, the third rule is one that my students, I would say, struggle with the most, and this is using commas after introductory words or phrases. And so what this means is that when you have an introductory phrase or a dependent clause that begins with a subordinating conjunction, words like because, although, after, since, when those start your sentence, you're going to put a comma after those introductory phrases before you get to the main clause. And so here's an example. Because his favorite team lost the Super Bowl, comma, he would not speak to anyone about the game for 2 years. Here's another example. Although they have stored a lot of food in their basement, I am not sure if they have enough for a zombie apocalypse. So these are two examples. The although one is one that really gives students a lot of trouble. A lot of times students want to put a comma after the although, like you would after however or something like that. But you don't. Although is a subordinating conjunction, so it needs a whole phrase with it. And so you want to make sure that you get the comma after the phrase. All right, so the next comma rule is related to essential and non-essential information. So basically, when you have non-essential information in the middle of a sentence, then you should set that phrase off with commas. And here's an example. The New York Yankees, who happen to be my favorite team, have won more World Series than any other baseball team. Extra words that come in the middle. The Boston Red Sox, however, have won the World Series only 7 times. So these are examples of where you have extra words or word that comes in the middle of the sentence, and you do need to set them off. Now, this rule gets a little tricky because some people struggle in determining, is that essential or non-essential? Do I need commas or not? And that can get tricky. There is some subjectivity there because it's about content. When I was younger, I was taught if you can pull the phrase out and it's still a complete sentence, then you know you need to set it off with commas. That is actually not correct. There are a lot of things that we get taught that are close to correct, or it would be nice if that was correct, but are not always the case. One tip that I like to give my students is that you know for sure that if the phrase begins with that, so here's a copy, her copy of Skyrim that I borrowed last week, the that makes it essential, and so you won't need the commas. But just remember, in general, the rule is if you have non-essential information, you must set it off with commas. And the way you determine essential and non-essential information is based on the meaning in the sentence and not structure. We'll look at the next rule, and this has to do with comma use with adjectives. I don't run into a whole lot of this issue with students, but basically the rule is this. It has to do with the rule called coordinate adjectives, and if you're using 2 or more adjectives to describe the same noun, so here it was a stressful, sleepless night. So These adjectives are coordinate, and the way you can test that is you can flip them and it still makes sense. It was a sleepless, stressful night, and that works. If you can flip them, that means they're coordinate and you need to put a comma in between it. Again, I don't see a whole lot of adjective use in academic writing, more than just, one adjective usually. But if you are using more than one adjective, think about the coordinate adjective rule and see if you can flip them. If you do, then you will need a comma. You will also use a comma to note strong shifts at the end of a sentence. Um, Again, I don't see a whole lot of this. You want me to fight Chuck Norris for you? I'm brave, comma, not crazy. So there is an example of what that is. This is the rule that just says if you have like a sharp contrast or a significant shift that comes at the end of the sentence, go ahead and set that off with a comma. Though again, this is something that you're probably not going to use quite as much as some of the others. Now, this one with quotes is one that you will probably use quite a bit if you're doing any kind of research paper. Now, if you're doing creative writing or a narrative, you may also have dialogue, but definitely when you're setting up a quote, most of the time you want to use a comma. There are a few exceptions. In general, when you're setting up the quote, you put a comma before you give the quote. So here's an example, one of my favorite lines from literature. As Bilbo Baggins said, I like half of you half as well as I should like, and like less than half of you half as well as you deserve. So the famous diss from Bilbo. But always set up the quote, and most of the time as you set up the quote, you're going to need a comma with that. Places and dates, I found that most of my students do pretty good. I should say pretty well with this comma rule. And I think it's one of the ones that's a little simpler. I remember being taught this in elementary school and having a pretty good sense of it. It just is the rule where you separate a city from a state with a comma. Technically, if you're writing in the sentence, you should have a comma after the state as well if it comes in the middle, with addresses, with dates. So December 21st, comma, 2012. Put the comma after the December 21st. So that one's pretty straightforward. The last thing I want to talk about is just comma abuse. One of the things that I like to tell my students is you can go through your paper and circle your commas. Then look at the list of comma rules. I'm going to post this web address for you from the Excelsior College OWL so you can come back and review these comma rules on your own. And what I would like you to do is then go through your paper and say, why is this comma here? And if you can't find a reason that that comma is there based on these comma rules, then that's something then you need to question. Should this comma really be there? Is this comma abuse? Should I pull it out? Now, one thing that I also want you to keep in mind when you're thinking about commas is that it is going to take you a little bit to master this. I was probably about a junior as an undergrad when I was like, okay, I'm all over the place with commas. Someone actually showed me a website that had all the commas rules listed, and I thought, you know what, these seem pretty simple, but I'm having trouble applying them. And this is what I did every time I went to edit my paper. So I should say this. Number one, please do not stress about commas while you're drafting, because you don't want stress about something minor like a comma impacting your content. But when you're ready to edit and you're ready to look at punctuation, typos, those kinds of things, before you do it, review the comma rules. And do this every time you edit a piece of your writing. It took me about 6 months of doing that. Every time I had a paper, I would review the comma rules and then edit. And I would also do some of that work where I would circle my commas and see, why they were there. After about 6 months, I started finding that I didn't have to look at the rules anymore in most cases. Some of them were still a little fuzzy for me, but most of the ones that I was using most often were very clear and I was able to apply it. So there is some work to be done in terms of actually improving your comma usage. I always tell my students that improving your writing is very much like learning to play a musical instrument. You'll get a little lesson from me or from whoever your writing teacher is. And then on your own, you have to take that lesson and go practice and practice and practice and practice. And that's how it is with commas. It will work. I promise you, they're not as mysterious and tricky as they seem. And the wonderful Excelsior College Owl summarizes all the rules so concisely for us. You may see a few different variations on the academic comma rules, but these are the main ones. These are the key ones, and I hope this is helpful. If you have any questions, just let me know, and I hope this video was helpful. Good luck with your commas, everyone.